to a little bit of a Q&A. So thank you guys. Thought that this was incredibly informative. I learned a lot. Uh,
Oh,
Not working.
there we go.
Yeah. Oh, not close enough. Sorry. Better. Thinking about cybersecurity, operational security, and physical security. For a company looking to kind of strengthen its defenses, how would you approach sort of balancing those both investment and financially, as well as the efforts across those areas? Kind of where to start.
I think the first thing that you need to do is take a look at your operational and the risks that you're facing specific to whatever the whether it's the commodities you're hauling or the lanes that you're running, or it's a little bit different for a broker than it is for a carrier. But really start with understanding what your risk exposure is, and then you want to design controls that again, like we talked about earlier, they depend on each other and are aware of each other. And it is a matter of just finding the balance point that addresses the most urgent risk to the organization. And maybe depending on what you're hauling, that may be some physical controls coupled with some awareness training, cybersecurity awareness training. But you also will need to build in your operational processes and sort of, it's a set of levers, and you have to find the right combination for your organization based on your specific risk.
That's anything to add to that.
I would say of the brokers that I work with, it is, I'm not going to just try and sell insurance up here, but I will say walking through a cyber event with that, we were just talking backstage about this, walking through a cyber event without the help of the forensic team that your cyber liability policy assigns to you is so much more complicated to walk through. It's very expensive out of pocket, and it's just completely consuming with man hours. And you're probably going to have to hire a third-party firm anyway. So
yeah, and that's just to add on to that. That's one of those things where running through those kind of practice runs, business continuity plans, and tabletop exercises around what are we going to do in an instant to uncover any gap that you may have either in your controls or in your available resources or your contacts. Do you have everybody involved in that process?
many don't have the process lined up at all.
Okay. That sounds like preparation, risk mitigation are also a huge theme of all of these things are leading to rising costs. Some of that mitigation coming from a lot of the folks here today, selling or representing tools that can help mitigate risk. Would you guys be willing to share like one brief horror story and a way that you have implemented or could suggest something to implement to prevent it in the future?
I mean, I can start, obviously a little bit unique to the returns market, but so one thing that we've seen that was pretty wild is effectively with rising costs, there is a much larger incentive for folks to be committing retail returns fraud, for sure. I think we're going to see more of that year over year. Retail returns fraud is outpacing e-commerce growth by a factor of about 3x. And so what we've seen is just how creative people can get here. So I think at the end of the day, what we always recommend, kind of going back to the last question, is you got to get a baseline. Like, where are you at? Most people can't actually measure, is this happening to me? Most retailers don't think that it is happening. But with the vast majority of retailers that we find, it definitely is happening. You need to baseline it. I think just having simple tools in place is something that we've seen is like really deflects the most common fraud vectors. So I think like from a horror story perspective, you should be able to find, whether it's, freight fraud or retail returns fraud, what are the most common vectors that I'm dealing with right now? And in a lot of cases, like a simple solution can be very, very effective because a lot of fraudsters, they're not trying to be in the business of going after, trying to find like small ways through the front door. A lot of them are finding like, what is the biggest opening I have? I'm going to go exploit that as much as I can. And the minute that I see that there's some friction or there's been some change or somebody's onto me, they're going to move and try to go after the next target. So I think basically making yourself not a soft target is going to be, really important. In terms of a horror story that we saw, we actually work with a high-end women's apparel retailer who, because of the rise of, again, related to cost, because of the rise of like brands like Quince and others, where they effectively sell, dupes of common products, that people were buying in mass a Quince brand sweater, and buying also a high-end $500 cashmere sweater. They were physically like setting up warehouse operations to switch the tags between the two. And then they were returning the $100 sweater and keeping the $500 sweaters and selling them through marketplaces.
Wow.
So if you don't have the right set of tools in place to identify these things in real time, a lot of the simplest things are going to be the most effective. So I think baseline it, put friction in place. The minute that fraudsters identify that there's friction, they tend to move on more often than not, at least in our experience.
That's great. I think on the cargo theft end, the technology partners is a very easy horror story example. When one of my clients has a cargo theft, if I'll ask what technology partners to use, if they don't utilize any, I'll have another client check. We'll go to Carrier Assure, and if they would have had a technology partner like Carrier Assure in place, they would see this carrier is failing. Not only that, they've always been failing. Same thing with Highway and other partners. We will see if you had access some of these softwares that go to identity verification sooner. If you'd made the investment, I hate to say it would have avoided you from the claim, but you would have avoided the claim. It would have been bold exclamation points, red flags all around the carrier that was selected for a load. On insurance, I can think of dozens more examples where we chose not to proceed with theft coverage because the cost involved. And then when a theft does happen, we're reminded of the renewal conversation where I've got to be very clear. You're self-insuring theft this year because you're not proceeding with theft coverage. So while your cargo coverage may have covered theft in the past, this is now an out-of-pocket expense for you should something occur. So we just want to be really clear about that. It's always going to be a cost to benefit ratio of should I pay for the thing that's going to help me if I get into that situation? And every broker needs to evaluate. Some brokers have never had a claim and they're going to choose to keep not purchasing theft coverage. And that's okay for them. That's a business decision. And they're going to handle the theft claims when they come. Others are going to buy the most robust and expensive theft package that they can because they want to make their shippers whole quickly and don't want it to be, they want it to be running smoothly in the background. They don't want to have to make hard business decisions when something happens.
Yeah, I think you touched on it a little bit, but I think it's about increasing the friction, and often you can do that by layering controls. And I've seen a couple of times recently where a lack of multiple layers of controls has resulted in an exponentially worse incident than would have been the case. Specific example, there was a smaller carrier that had been victim of a double brokering situation. But they also, during the social engineering aspect of this, they were talked into making a change to payment information, bank account information. And within a matter of hours, the account had been empty. And so, it went from losing one load to losing the contents of an operating account, expense account. For a smaller carrier, that can end up being a catastrophic business. So it's really protecting in multiple layers of operational controls.
Okay, so to kind of wrap it up and ask a final question, we've talked about technology playing a vital role as well as awareness, right? From a prevention and mitigation standpoint, if you were just starting out trying to figure out what you would do to combat risk, how would you vet those tools? Where would you start? What would be your first step?
I didn't hear the last part of the question.
What would be your first step in making a plan to combat fraud if you were just kind of getting into looking at making your great fraud prevention plan?
I think you need to start with looking at your processes, looking at your just your business processes in general, and then figuring out those points where you can put in the friction in those business processes. And that may be through a second set of approvals on some operating procedure. It may be a vendor vetting platform, carrier vetting platform, piece of technology, and it may be a physical, process change or adding security features to a facility. But I think understanding your business processes and then the choke points in those processes.
I think that's addressed differently by different size companies as well. Some have a robust technology in-house team that's building software for them. Some have, a very small team of 2 carrier sales reps that are interfacing with motor carriers, and they've got to attack the risk very differently. But I think when the leadership of an organization has a conversation with the frontline team that is actually communicating with motor carriers, that's where it starts on the risk end to try and prevent cargo theft specifically for a broker. Because when those communications don't happen, when the insurance program is just assumed to be robust by the frontline reps, oftentimes they can be seen as less careful in the carrier vetting and selection process. So when leadership at a company is able to demonstrate that we need to take the same great care in vetting and approving and assigning carriers, because it has major business implications for us. When that comes from the top of the organization on down, I think it makes a big difference in opening up the communication where a rep might not be might be taking the path of least resistance in booking a load, and it leaves colossal exposure that may or may not get picked up by insurance. So it's good to have those conversations early and at all levels of the organization, I would say.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I first said, and I won't add on anything that they already said, which is if you don't have good data in place across your organization of where you actually think that you're exposed to various vectors of fraud, you need to get it in place. You can't fix what you can't measure. And so I think that's really important. And then one other thing I'll say is not necessarily a starting out point, but I think is a really important point for the industry writ large is I think the industry really needs to collaborate. I think you need to talk to your peers. You need to, we're all a lot of folks in this room are very competitive. But if you're not collaborating, in my opinion, you best believe that fraudsters are collaborating. They're communicating in ways we see it every day around like who's like open for business for fraud, how people pull it off in different ways. There's a lot of folks all across the world that are very technical that are collaborating in real time to defraud everybody in this room. And so if we're not collaborating in a lot of ways, I think we're going to lose. So I think it's really, really important to think about how you can collaborate across the industry, even at simple things like this of just meeting your colleagues at different and your kind of peers at different companies to exchange stories and figure out how we can solve it together.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.